In a remote Montana valley, a young woman vanished after rejecting a neighbor's advance, but with only 2 sheriffs covering 2,000 square miles and a 40-minute response time, the case went cold before it even began. 25 years later, a discarded coffee cup in a gas station trash would expose the truth hiding in plain sight. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with the latest cases. The Madison Valley stretched out like an endless ocean of grass beneath Montana's legendary Big Sky. In the summer of 1998, the valley was home to barely 300 souls scattered across ranches and small properties, connected by gravel roads that turned to mud when the rains came. The nearest town of any size, Ennis, sat 20 miles to the north, population 800. To the east, the Madison Range rose in jagged peaks still capped with snow even in July. To the west, the gravelly range formed a gentler barrier against the setting sun. Between these mountain walls, the Madison River wound its way north, drawing fly fishermen from across the country to its legendary trout waters. It was a landscape that inspired photographers and poets, a place where eagles circled overhead and elk grazed at dawn. But it was also a landscape of profound isolation. When trouble came to the Madison Valley, help was never close. The Madison County Sheriff's Office operated with a skeleton crew, 2 deputies responsible for patrolling over 2,000 square miles of mountains, rivers, and ranch land. Response times of 40 minutes were not unusual. An hour was common. In winter, when snow closed the mountain passes, some residents could be cut off entirely for days. This was not a failure of the system but simply the reality of law enforcement in rural Montana, where vast distances and limited tax bases made adequate coverage nearly impossible. The valley had a long history, stretching back to the days when Shoshone and Crow peoples hunted buffalo across these plains. In the 1860s, gold was discovered in nearby Virginia City, and the valley became a route for prospectors heading to the mining camp. Remnants of that era still dotted the landscape. Abandoned cabins slowly collapsed into the earth, their timbers weathered gray by decades of Montana winters. Rusting equipment lay half-buried in creek beds where miners had once panned for gold. Forgotten graves marked by weathered wooden crosses stood in small clearings, the names long since worn away by wind and rain. The valley had seen boom and bust, had watched fortunes made and lost, had buried its share of dreamers and desperados. But by 1998, it had settled into a quiet rhythm, a place where families had ranched the same land for 4 or 5 generations, where everybody knew everybody, and where violent crime was virtually unknown. This was the world that 23-year-old Jennifer Hayes called home in the summer of 1998. She had grown up in Bozeman, 90 miles to the northeast, where her father worked as a civil engineer for the city and her mother taught 4th grade at Hawthorne Elementary School. Jennifer had been an exceptional student, graduating near the top of her high school class before attending Montana State University. There, she discovered her passion for wildlife biology, spending her summers volunteering at raptor rehabilitation centers and her winters studying migration patterns of northern species. After graduating with honors, Jennifer had taken a seasonal position with the Forest Service, conducting raptor surveys in the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest. The job paid barely above minimum wage and offered no benefits, but it put her in the field she loved. 5 days a week, she would wake before dawn, pack her field gear, and hike into the mountains with binoculars, spotting scopes, and datasheet. She documented golden eagle nests, tracked peregrine falcon populations, and monitored the recovery of bald eagles in southwestern Montana. It was solitary work, often physically demanding, but Jennifer thrived in it. Her supervisor would later say she had an almost intuitive understanding of raptor behavior, an ability to predict where birds would nest and hunt that came from countless hours of patient observation. Jennifer was the kind of person who made friends easily despite her preference for solitude in the field. At the Ennis General Store, the clerks knew her by name and asked about her bird surveys. She would spend 15 minutes describing a golden eagle nest she'd found, her enthusiasm infectious. At the local cafe, she'd sit at the counter with her field notes and chat with ranchers about wildlife they'd seen on their properties, offering tips on how to coexist with predators like mountain lions and bears. She was passionate about conservation but never preachy, understanding that in rural Montana, you had to respect the culture of people who made their living off the land. That balance, that ability to bridge the gap between environmental advocacy and agricultural tradition, made her respected in a community that was often suspicious of outsiders. Jennifer rented a small cabin on the McAllister property, an old homestead that had been in the same family since the 1880s when Jennifer's great-great-grandfather had claimed the land under the Homestead Act. The cabin had been built as a line shack, a shelter for cowboys watching over cattle during the summer grazing season. Over the years it had been expanded and modernized, though modern was a relative term. It had electricity supplied by overhead lines that sometimes went down in winter storms, and running water from a well that occasionally ran dry in late summer. But there was no phone line. Cell service in the valley was non-existent, the mountains blocking signals from the nearest tower in Ennis. Jennifer communicated with her family and the Forest Service office via a handheld VHF radio, checking in each morning and evening as required by Forest Service safety protocols. The cabin sat in a small grove of cottonwood trees about 200 yards from the main ranch road, with a view across the valley to the Madison Range. Jennifer had furnished it simply with things she'd brought from Bozeman or found at yard sales in Ennis. A narrow bed with a worn quilt her grandmother had made. A small table and 2 mismatched chairs. A propane stove for cooking. Shelves lined with field guides and wildlife biology textbooks, their spines cracked from use. On the walls she'd tacked topographic maps of her survey areas, marked with colored pins indicating nest locations and observation points. She'd also hung photos of raptors she'd documented, beautiful images of eagles and falcons frozen in flight or perched on rocky outcrops, their fierce eyes staring directly at the camera. The main ranch house sat a quarter-mile down a dirt track. Dorothy and Frank McAllister, both in their 70s, had welcomed Jennifer warmly when she moved in that May. Dorothy would sometimes invite Jennifer to dinner, and Jennifer would help with small tasks around the ranch in return, mending fences or helping move irrigation pipe. The McAllisters appreciated having a young person around, someone whose energy and enthusiasm reminded them of their own children, long since moved away to careers in Denver and Seattle. Dorothy would pack extra food when she cooked, knowing Jennifer often forgot to eat properly when she was focused on her work. Frank would check on the cabin's propane tank and well pump, making sure everything was functioning properly. It was an arrangement that worked well for everyone, providing Jennifer with affordable housing and the McAllisters with someone to keep an eye on the property. Jennifer's nearest neighbor to the south was Dale Richter, a 46-year-old man who lived alone in a weathered single-wide trailer surrounded by junked vehicles and rusting farm equipment. Dale's property was a stark contrast to the well-maintained ranches around it. The trailer sat at the end of a rutted driveway, its once white siding now gray with age and streaked with rust from a leaking roof. The yard was cluttered with the accumulated debris of years. 3 or 4 old pickup trucks in various states of disassembly, their hoods open and engines exposed to the elements. A rusting horse trailer with flat tires and a broken axle. Piles of lumber and corrugated metal roofing that Dale had scavenged from abandoned buildings. Empty propane tanks. Coils of barbed wire. A collection of tools and equipment that might have had value once but now sat forgotten and rusting. A few scraggly chickens pecked around the yard, and 2 dogs, a blue heeler mix and an old yellow lab, were chained to posts near the trailer. The dogs barked ferociously at anyone who approached, though Dale insisted they were friendly once you got to know them. Dale had moved to Montana from North Dakota 15 years earlier, drawn by the promise of work in the oil fields near the Wyoming border during the energy boom of the early 1980s. He'd worked as a roughneck for 3 years, hard physical labor that paid well but demanded long hours and offered no job security. When oil prices crashed in the mid-1980s and the drilling companies started laying off workers, Dale found himself unemployed in a state where he knew almost no one. But instead of returning to North Dakota, he'd stayed, perhaps because Montana offered a kind of freedom he'd never experienced before, or perhaps because he had nothing to return to. His parents were dead, he had no siblings, and the few friends he'd had in North Dakota had long since moved on with their lives. Dale picked up work where he could find it, mostly as a ranch hand and handyman. He was reliable when it came to physical labor, never complained about hard or dirty jobs, and charged reasonable rates. Ranchers would call him when they needed help with branding or haying, when fences needed mending or irrigation systems needed repair. He knew how to work on older vehicles and farm equipment, skills that were valuable in a community where people kept trucks and tractors running for decades. But despite his reliability, there was something about Dale that made people uneasy, especially women. He had a habit of staring, his pale blue eyes fixing on people with an intensity that felt invasive and inappropriate. He asked personal questions that crossed boundaries, wanting to know about people's relationships, their families, where they lived, what their routines were. When women tried to politely deflect these questions, Dale would persist, seemingly oblivious to social cues that would have stopped most people. He stood too close during conversations, invaded personal space in ways that made people step back. His hygiene was poor. His clothes were often stained and unwashed. He had a musty smell that suggested he rarely bathed. Most people in the valley attributed this to social awkwardness and isolation, the result of a lonely man who'd never quite learned how to interact normally with others. But some sensed something darker, a quality they couldn't quite articulate but that made them wary of being alone with him. Jennifer had encountered Dale several times during her first weeks in the valley. He'd stopped by her cabin once in early June, ostensibly to ask if she needed any help with repairs or maintenance. But the visit had stretched uncomfortably long. Dale had invited himself inside, looking around at her belongings with an interest that felt more like inventory than casual curiosity. He'd asked where she was from, whether she had a boyfriend, how long she'd be staying in the valley. Jennifer had answered politely but minimally, trying to signal that she had work to do. But Dale had lingered for nearly half an hour before finally leaving, and even then only after Jennifer had explicitly said she needed to prepare for the next day's survey. Another time in mid-June, Jennifer had seen Dale's truck parked on the road near the trailhead where she started her morning surveys. It was barely dawn, the sun just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Jennifer had parked her truck and was gathering her gear when she noticed Dale sitting in his vehicle about 50 yards away, the engine idling. He was watching her, making no attempt to hide it. When Jennifer waved uncertainly, Dale didn't wave back. He just stared for another long moment, then put his truck in gear and drove away slowly, still watching her in his rearview mirror. Jennifer had mentioned these encounters to Dorothy McAllister, who'd frowned with concern. Dale's harmless, Dorothy had said, but the way she said it suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. He can be odd, especially around women. If he makes you uncomfortable, you tell Frank or me right away. Don't try to be polite if you feel unsafe. Out here, you have to trust your instincts. Jennifer had promised she would, but she'd also felt slightly embarrassed, as if she were overreacting to what might be nothing more than social awkwardness from a lonely man. On the evening of July 16th, a Thursday, Jennifer drove into Ennis to pick up supplies at the general store. The day had been hot, temperatures in the mid-90s, unusual for this elevation. Jennifer had finished her field work early, driven back to her cabin to write up her notes, then headed into town around 6:30. The drive took about 20 minutes on the winding valley road, past ranches and hay fields turning golden in the evening light. The Madison Range rose to her left, its peaks still snow-capped, while the gravelly range formed a darker mass to her right, the setting sun beginning to paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink. The Ennis General Store was a local institution, a wooden building that had stood on the same corner since 1902. Inside, it smelled of coffee and old wood and the faint mustiness of a building that had absorbed over 90 years of Montana weather. Jennifer chatted with the clerk, Susan Hartley, a woman in her 60s who'd worked at the store for 30 years and knew everyone in the valley by name. They talked about the heat wave that had settled over southwestern Montana, about how the Madison River was running low, about how the fishing guides were worried about the impact on the fall season. Jennifer bought a bag of groceries, pasta and vegetables and a package of chicken, along with batteries for her headlamp and a new spiral-bound notebook for field observations. She paid with cash, $27.38, and Susan made change from the old mechanical register that still worked perfectly despite its age. Jennifer left the store around 7:15 and headed back south toward her cabin. The sun was lower now, the light taking on that golden quality that photographers love, everything glowing as if lit from within. She had the windows down in her Toyota pickup, her arm resting on the door, her dark hair blowing in the wind. The radio picked up a Bozeman station playing classic rock, Tom Petty singing about running down a dream. Jennifer sang along, tapping her hand on the steering wheel, feeling content in a way that only comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you love. She was 23 years old, healthy, pursuing work that mattered, living in one of the most beautiful places on earth. In that moment, driving through the Madison Valley as the sun set over the mountains, Jennifer Hayes had every reason to believe the future stretched before her bright and full of possibility. She arrived at the McAllister property around 7:30, the sun still well above the western mountains but its light beginning to soften and deepen. She parked her truck in the small dirt area beside the cabin, grabbed her grocery bags, and went inside. The cabin was warm, the afternoon sun having heated it up despite the shade from the cottonwood. Jennifer opened the windows to let in the cooler evening air, then began putting away her groceries. She placed the vegetables in the small propane refrigerator, set the chicken on a plate to thaw, and was arranging canned goods on a shelf when she heard a knock at the door. Jennifer paused, listening. Visitors were rare at this hour. The McAllisters occasionally stopped by, but they usually called out a greeting rather than knocking formally. She walked to the door, wiping her hands on her jeans, and opened it to find Dale Richter standing on her small porch. Dale was wearing dirty jeans stained with oil or grease, and a faded red flannel shirt despite the heat. His hair, thinning on top and going gray at the temples, looked uncombed and greasy. He needed a shave, several days' growth of beard darkening his jaw. In his right hand he held a large adjustable wrench, turning it over and over in a nervous gesture that seemed unconscious. He looked agitated, his eyes not quite meeting Jennifer's, his weight shifting from foot to foot. His story came out in a rush. His truck had broken down about a mile up the road toward the north. The engine had just died, wouldn't start again. He thought it might be the fuel pump, but he wasn't sure. Could Jennifer give him a ride back to his place so he could get his other vehicle and some tools? He lived just a couple miles south. It wouldn't take long. He was sorry to bother her, knew she was probably busy, but he didn't know who else to ask. The McAllisters had gone into Bozeman for a few days to visit their daughter. He'd seen their house was dark. Jennifer was the only neighbor close enough to help. Jennifer hesitated, her hands still on the door frame. Every instinct told her to say no. The encounters with Dale over the past months had left her uneasy, that feeling women learn to recognize and trust, the sense that something is off even when you can't articulate exactly what. She didn't want to be alone in a vehicle with Dale. She didn't want to go to his property. But she also felt the weight of rural Montana culture, where refusing to help a neighbor was a serious breach of unwritten code. Out here, where help could be hours away when you really needed it, people helped each other. You pulled someone out of a ditch in winter. You gave someone a ride when their vehicle broke down. You helped a neighbor move cattle or put up hay. It was how the system worked, and refusing could mark you as someone who didn't understand or respect the way things were done. Jennifer's mind raced through options. She could offer to drive to Ennis and call someone from there, but Dale would surely say that was unnecessary, that he just needed a quick ride. She could suggest waiting until the McAllisters returned, but they weren't due back until the weekend. She could simply refuse, close the door, but what would she say? That she had a bad feeling? That Dale made her uncomfortable? Those seemed like thin reasons to refuse a simple request from a neighbor who was stranded. She agreed, a decision that would haunt those who loved her for the rest of their lives. Dale thanked her profusely, too profusely, his gratitude making her even more uncomfortable. Jennifer grabbed her keys from the small table by the door. She didn't bring her radio, didn't tell anyone where she was going, didn't take any of the precautions that Forest Service training had taught her about working alone in remote areas. She simply walked out to her truck with Dale following behind her, still clutching the wrench. Dale climbed into the passenger seat, and Jennifer noticed his hands were trembling slightly. She asked if he was all right. He nodded quickly, saying he'd been working in the heat all day and was probably just dehydrated. Should have drunk more water. Jennifer started the engine and pulled out onto the ranch road, then turned north on the main valley highway as Dale directed. The sun was lower now, perhaps an hour from setting, the light rich and golden across the hay fields and grasslands. Jennifer tried to make small talk, filling the uncomfortable silence. She asked about Dale's work, whether he'd been busy with ranch jobs. Dale's answers were short, distracted. He kept glancing at her, then looking away when she met his eyes. His breathing was audible, heavier than normal. The smell of unwashed clothing and stale sweat filled the cab of the truck, making Jennifer crack her window further despite the warm air outside. They drove north for about 10 minutes, past several ranches and clusters of mailboxes marking invisible driveways that led back to distant homes. Jennifer was beginning to wonder how far they'd have to go when Dale told her to slow down, that his truck should be just ahead near where a small creek crossed under the road. There was a wide pull-out there where vehicles sometimes parked, fishermen accessing the creek or hunters glassing for deer in the foothills. But when they reached the spot, there was no truck. The pull-out was empty except for a weathered fence post and some tall grass swaying in the evening breeze. Jennifer slowed to a stop, confused, and turned to Dale with a question forming on her lips. "Where's your truck? Did we pass it?" That's when she saw the gun. Dale had pulled it from his jacket pocket, a snub-nosed revolver that looked old and worn but undeniably real and undeniably pointed at her. The wrench lay forgotten on the floorboard. Dale's hand was no longer trembling. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost apologetic, but with an undertone that sent ice through Jennifer's veins. "Keep driving," he said. "Turn left up ahead where the logging road goes into the mountains. Don't try anything stupid. I don't want to hurt you, Jennifer. I really don't. But I will if I have to. Just do what I say and everything will be fine." Jennifer's heart slammed against her ribs. Her hands on the steering wheel felt distant, disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else. The world narrowed to the gun pointed at her and the stretch of highway ahead. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. She could try to crash the truck, deliberately wreck them both, but at this speed it might kill her and Dale would still have the gun. She could try to grab the gun, but Dale was bigger and stronger and the truck was moving. She could refuse, but what then? Would Dale shoot her here on the highway? Or would he force her to drive at gunpoint anyway? She decided to comply, at least for now. As long as she was alive and conscious, there was a chance. If she could stay calm, stay alert, maybe an opportunity would present itself. Maybe another vehicle would come along. Maybe she could signal for help somehow. But even as these thoughts formed, she knew how unlikely they were. This was the Madison Valley on a Thursday evening. Traffic was minimal. The logging road Dale had mentioned was remote, rarely used except during hunting season. Jennifer slowed as they approached an unmarked dirt road that branched off to the left, climbing into the foothills of the gravelly range. A faded sign indicated it was Forest Service Road 3374, closed to vehicles from December through May. It was now July, and the road was technically open, though it looked like it hadn't seen much traffic. The entrance was partially overgrown with grass and sagebrush. "Turn here," Dale said, gesturing with the gun. Jennifer turned, the truck bouncing over the rough transition from pavement to dirt. The road immediately began to climb, winding between low hills covered with sagebrush and scattered pines. The surface was rutted and rocky, forcing Jennifer to slow to a crawl. Branches from overhanging trees scraped the sides of the truck with a sound like fingernails on metal. As they drove deeper into the mountains, Dale began to talk. His voice had changed, becoming almost conversational, as if they were old friends taking a drive together rather than a woman being held at gunpoint by a man with clearly terrible intentions. He said he'd been watching her all summer. He knew her routines, knew when she left for her surveys each morning, when she came back each afternoon. He'd followed her into Ennis several times, parking where he could see her truck outside the store or the cafe, waiting for her to come out. He knew she was living alone, knew she didn't have a boyfriend. He'd asked around, talked to people, pieced together information about her life. Dale said he'd tried to work up the courage to ask her out properly, maybe invite her to dinner in Ennis or suggest they go fishing together. He thought they could be good together if she just gave him a chance. He wasn't like the college boys she probably dated in Bozeman. He was a real man, someone who knew how to work with his hands, someone who understood Montana and the lifestyle here. He could take care of her, protect her, show her what it meant to be with someone who appreciated her. But every time he tried to approach her, Dale said, she'd given him that look. The look women gave him that told him he wasn't good enough, wasn't attractive enough, wasn't worth her time. The polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. The excuses about being busy. The way she'd step back when he got too close, as if he was something dirty she didn't want to touch. He'd tried being patient, tried waiting for the right moment, but there wasn't going to be a right moment. She was going to finish her summer job and leave, go back to Bozeman or move on to some other place, and he'd never see her again. This was his only chance. Jennifer listened to this monologue with growing horror. Dale's words revealed a fantasy he'd constructed, a relationship that existed only in his mind. She realized that nothing she said or did mattered. Dale had decided how this was going to go, had perhaps been planning it for weeks or months. The broken-down truck story had been a lie. He'd come to her cabin with a purpose, with a plan. The gun hadn't been a spontaneous decision. He'd brought it deliberately. Jennifer forced herself to stay calm, to keep her voice level. She told Dale she was flattered by his interest, but she wasn't looking for a relationship right now. She needed to focus on her work, on building her career. Maybe they could be friends instead. She could introduce him to some of the other women she knew in Bozeman, women who might be interested in dating. This was a desperate attempt to de-escalate, to appeal to reason, to humanize herself to him in hopes that he might reconsider whatever he was planning. Dale shook his head, a sad smile on his face. He said he appreciated what she was trying to do, but it was too late for that. He knew how this worked. She'd say whatever she thought he wanted to hear right now, but as soon as he let her go, she'd run to the police. She'd tell everyone what happened. He'd end up in jail, and she'd go back to her life as if nothing had occurred. That wasn't acceptable. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to have what he wanted. And he was going to take it. The road climbed steadily, the valley falling away behind them. They were deep in the forest now, surrounded by lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The sun had dropped below the western ridge, and twilight was gathering quickly in the mountains. The temperature was dropping too, the air through the open windows now cool enough to raise goosebumps on Jennifer's arms. Jennifer knew these mountains from her survey work. She'd hiked trails throughout this area, had studied topographic maps, knew the general layout of drainages and ridges. She knew that if Dale took her much deeper into this wilderness, her chances of survival dropped to almost zero. If he got her to some remote location, some abandoned cabin or mine shaft, no one would find her. The Forest Service wouldn't miss her until she failed to make her morning radio check-in, and even then it would take hours for a search to be organized. By the time anyone started looking, Dale could have her miles from anywhere, hidden where searchers would never think to look. As they rounded a sharp curve in the road, the truck bouncing over a particularly rough section, Jennifer made a split-second decision. It was now or never. If she waited until they reached wherever Dale was taking her, it would be too late. Her only chance was here, now, while they were still moving, while Dale was slightly off balance. She slammed both feet on the brake pedal with all her strength. The truck lurched violently, tires skidding on loose gravel. Dale pitched forward, his head nearly hitting the dashboard, the gun pointing briefly away from her. In that instant, Jennifer threw open the driver's side door and hurled herself out of the moving truck. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Rocks and gravel tore at her hands and arms. She rolled, momentum carrying her off the road and into the brush beside it. For a moment she lay stunned, her vision graying at the edges, pain shooting through her left shoulder where she'd landed. Then survival instinct kicked in. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain, and ran. The forest closed around her immediately. She crashed through underbrush, branches whipping at her face and arms. Behind her she heard Dale shouting her name, his voice alternating between anger and something that might have been pleading. "Jennifer, come back. Don't be stupid. You'll get lost out here. I'm not going to hurt you." But she didn't stop. Her Forest Service training took over. She angled uphill, toward where the trees grew thicker, where the terrain would be harder for someone to follow quickly. She zigged and zagged, using trees for cover, trying to make herself a difficult target. Her boots, sturdy hiking boots she wore for field work, gave her better traction than Dale's worn work boots would provide. She was younger, lighter, in better physical condition from months of hiking mountain trails. If she could put enough distance between them, if she could lose him in the forest, she might have a chance. The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence. The crack of the revolver echoed through the trees, and Jennifer heard the bullet hit wood somewhere to her left, the distinct thunk of lead striking a tree trunk. She changed direction instinctively, her heart hammering so hard she could hear blood rushing in her ears. She ran harder, her lungs burning, the thin mountain air insufficient for the oxygen her muscles demanded. Another shot, closer this time. She heard the bullet whine past her head, heard it strike a tree just ahead of her, bark and splinters exploding outward. A piece of bark struck her cheek, stinging, and she felt blood but didn't slow down. The terrain was getting steeper, rockier. Jennifer's boots slipped on loose stones. She grabbed at branches to pull herself upward, thorns from wild rose bushes tearing at her hands. Behind her she could hear Dale crashing through the forest, could hear his labored breathing and muttered curses as he struggled up the slope. Jennifer's left ankle caught on a hidden root. Her foot twisted violently and she went down hard, tumbling sideways over a fallen log. She landed on her back, the impact driving the breath from her lungs for the second time. Pain exploded in her ankle, sharp and immediate. She tried to scramble up, but when she put weight on the ankle it buckled, white-hot agony shooting up her leg. She was injured, unable to run, at least 50 yards from the nearest road, and Dale was somewhere in the trees behind her, working his way toward where she'd fallen. Jennifer looked around desperately for a weapon, anything she could use to defend herself. There were rocks, branches, but nothing that seemed adequate against a man with a gun. She crawled behind a large boulder, pressing herself into the space between the rock and a downed log, trying to make herself as small as possible. She could hear Dale now, closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He was moving through the forest methodically, searching. His voice drifted through the trees. "Jennifer, I know you're hurt. I heard you fall. There's no point hiding. You can't walk on that ankle. Just come out and we can talk about this. I told you I don't want to hurt you. Why are you making this so hard?" Jennifer held her breath, not daring to move. Through gaps in the brush she could see patches of darkening sky. The sun was gone, twilight deepening toward night. In another 20 minutes it would be too dark to see clearly. If she could stay hidden until then, maybe Dale would give up, go back to the truck. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a false hope. Dale had crossed a line. He'd pulled a gun on her, kidnapped her, shot at her. He couldn't let her go now. She was a witness to attempted murder. Dale's boots appeared in her line of vision, just on the other side of the boulder where she was hiding. He was standing perhaps 10 feet away, turning slowly, scanning the forest. Jennifer could hear his breathing, rapid and harsh. She pressed herself flatter against the ground, praying he wouldn't look down, wouldn't see the gap where she was concealed. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then Dale took a step forward, another, walking slowly around the boulder. Jennifer knew he was going to find her. There was no way to stay hidden. When he came around the end of the boulder, he would see her immediately. She decided to act first. As Dale's boots came into view at the edge of the log, Jennifer lunged upward, grabbing a rock the size of a softball, and swung it at Dale's knee with all the force she could muster. The rock connected solidly, and Dale howled in pain and surprise, his leg buckling. He staggered backward, the gun swinging wildly but not firing. Jennifer tried to rise, tried to run, but her injured ankle gave way immediately and she fell again. Dale recovered his balance and lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. Jennifer screamed and fought, clawing at his face with her free hand, her fingernails raking across his cheek and drawing blood. Dale cursed and struck her with the pistol, a brutal blow to the side of her head that sent light exploding behind her eyes. The world went gray and blurry. Jennifer felt herself being dragged, felt rocks and branches scraping against her back, but it all seemed distant, disconnected. She tried to resist, but her body wouldn't respond properly. Everything was fading, sound becoming muffled, vision narrowing to a tunnel. She was vaguely aware of Dale's voice, saying something she couldn't quite understand, and then even that faded into darkness. When Jennifer's supervisor at the Forest Service, Tom Beckwith, tried to reach her by radio the next morning at 7:30 for their scheduled check-in, there was no response. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Radio communications in the mountains could be finicky, blocked by terrain or interference. Tom tried several more times over the next hour, his concern growing each time he heard only static. By 9 o'clock, when Jennifer still hadn't responded and hadn't shown up at the ranger station in Ennis for their weekly meeting, Tom knew something was seriously wrong. He drove out to the McAllister property, arriving around 10:30. The cabin door was unlocked, which was Jennifer's habit during the day, but something about the scene immediately struck Tom as wrong. Inside, groceries were still sitting on the counter, food Jennifer had obviously bought the previous evening. A package of chicken had been placed on a plate to thaw but had sat out all night and into the morning, spoiled and starting to smell in the summer heat. The propane refrigerator was running, its door properly closed, but only half the groceries had been put away. Canned goods sat on the counter. Vegetables that should have been refrigerated lay beside them. Jennifer's field gear hung neatly by the door, her daypack with its first aid kit and emergency supplies, her binoculars in their worn leather case, her spotting scope in its padded bag. Everything she would need for a day in the field was still here. Her wallet sat on the small table, containing her driver's license, a Forest Service ID card, and $43 in cash. Her field notebooks, meticulous records of every observation she'd made that summer, lay stacked on a shelf. What was missing was Jennifer herself and her truck. Tom stood in the middle of the small cabin, trying to make sense of the scene. It looked like Jennifer had come home, started putting away groceries, and then left suddenly. But why would she leave without her field gear? Why would she leave without her wallet? Jennifer was meticulous about safety protocols, about carrying identification and emergency supplies. She would never go into the field without her pack. Tom immediately drove to the main ranch house to see if the McAllisters knew anything, but he found the house locked and dark. He remembered Jennifer mentioning that they were visiting family in Bozeman for a few days. He returned to the cabin and used Jennifer's radio to call the Forest Service office in Ennis, requesting that they contact the Madison County Sheriff's Office immediately. Then he began making calls himself, reaching out to Jennifer's friends and co-workers, her parents in Bozeman, anyone who might know where she was. Deputy Ray Coleman took the call from the Forest Service at 2:15 that afternoon. He was the sole deputy on duty, his partner Jim Harris having driven to Bozeman that morning to transport a prisoner. Ray was 58 years old, a man who'd spent his entire adult life in Madison County. He'd been born in Ennis, had graduated from high school there, had joined the sheriff's department at age 35 after working as a ranch hand and carpenter. He'd been a deputy for 23 years, had seen his share of accidents, domestic disputes, bar fights, and the occasional theft. But he'd never worked a case like this. Young women didn't vanish from Madison County. The county had one of the lowest crime rates in Montana, a place where most people didn't lock their doors, where the biggest law enforcement problems were usually drunk drivers, disputes over water rights, or teenagers getting into mischief. Violent crime against women was virtually unheard of. The last homicide in Madison County had been in 1983, 15 years earlier, when a man had shot his brother during an argument over an inheritance. Before that, you had to go back to the 1970s. Ray drove out to the McAllister property, arriving around 3 o'clock. Tom Beckwith was waiting for him, pacing nervously in front of the cabin. Together they went through the scene again, Ray taking notes, photographing everything with his department-issued camera. He examined the groceries on the counter, the spoiled chicken, the wallet on the table. He noted that Jennifer's bed was made, her cabin was clean and organized, nothing appeared disturbed or ransacked. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of forced entry. Whatever had happened, it had happened after Jennifer left the cabin voluntarily. Ray asked Tom about Jennifer's habits, her routines, whether she had enemies or problems with anyone. Tom said Jennifer was universally liked, dedicated to her work, responsible beyond her years. She had no enemies that he knew of. She wasn't involved in any disputes or controversies. Her work was straightforward wildlife survey, nothing that would generate conflict. The only thing Tom could think of was that Jennifer had mentioned a neighbor who made her uncomfortable, someone who'd stopped by her cabin uninvited and seemed to watch her. Tom couldn't remember the name, thought it might have started with a D. Ray felt something cold settle in his stomach. Dale Richter lived just down the road, less than 2 miles south. Ray knew Dale, had dealt with him on a few minor matters over the years. Dale had been questioned once about harassment complaints from women in Ennis, though nothing had come of it. The women had declined to press charges, saying Dale was just creepy but hadn't actually threatened them. Ray made a note to talk to Dale, but first he needed to find Jennifer's truck. He radioed the sheriff's office and requested that all available units begin searching the valley roads for Jennifer's white Toyota pickup. But all available units meant his partner Jim, who wouldn't be back from Bozeman until evening, and Sheriff Tom Mackenzie, who was tied up testifying in district court in Virginia City and couldn't leave until the court day ended. Ray was essentially on his own. He began systematically driving the roads that spiderwebbed through the valley, stopping at every ranch house, every trailer, every cluster of buildings, asking if anyone had seen Jennifer or her truck. The first few stops yielded nothing. People remembered seeing Jennifer drive past toward her cabin the previous evening, probably around 7:30 or 8, but no one had seen her after that. An elderly rancher named Ed Parker thought he might have seen a white pickup on one of the back roads around 9 o'clock, but he couldn't be sure. It was getting dark and white pickups were common in the valley. At the Richter property, Ray found Dale working on a tractor engine in the yard in front of his trailer. It was around 5:30 in the afternoon, the shadows lengthening across the valley. Dale was bent over the engine, his hands black with grease, tools scattered on the ground around him. The 2 dogs were barking furiously at Ray's patrol car, straining at their chains. Dale straightened up when he saw Ray, wiping his hands on a rag that was already filthy. Ray explained the situation. A young woman who lived up the road was missing, hadn't been heard from since last night. Had Dale seen or heard anything unusual? Did he know Jennifer Hayes? Dale's reaction seemed nervous, but then Dale always seemed nervous around law enforcement. He said he knew who Jennifer was, the Forest Service girl staying at the McAllister place. He'd seen her around, maybe talked to her once or twice. Yesterday evening, he'd heard a truck drive past, probably hers, heading south toward the McAllister property. That would have been around 7:30 or 8 o'clock. After that, nothing. He'd been home all evening working on his vehicles. He lived alone, so no one could verify that, but it was the truth. He hadn't seen Jennifer, didn't know where she might be. Ray made notes, studying Dale's face, trying to read whether the man was lying. Dale wouldn't meet his eyes, kept looking down at his greasy hands or over at the tractor. But was that guilt or just Dale's usual awkwardness? Ray couldn't tell. He thanked Dale and moved on, continuing his rounds of the valley. By nightfall, there was still no sign of Jennifer Hayes. Ray enlisted the help of volunteers, putting out word through the local radio station and by phone. Ranchers and their families, friends of the McAllisters, people who knew Jennifer from Ennis, they all responded. Within 2 hours, over 30 people had assembled at the ranger station in Ennis. They divided into search teams, assigned areas, and spread out across the valley. They searched through the night with flashlights and truck spotlights, calling Jennifer's name into the vast Montana darkness, their voices swallowed by wind and distance. The next morning, Friday, July 17th, Sheriff Tom Mackenzie returned from Virginia City and took command of the search. Tom was in his early 60s, a tall man with weathered features and steel-gray hair. He'd been sheriff for 16 years and a deputy for 12 years before that. He knew every inch of Madison County, knew most of the people who lived there, understood the challenges of law enforcement in such a vast, sparsely populated area. But he'd never faced anything like this. A young woman, well-liked and responsible, had vanished without a trace. No witnesses, no evidence, just an abandoned cabin and a missing truck. Tom organized the volunteers into systematic search teams. He called in additional help from neighboring counties, from the Forest Service, from the Montana Highway Patrol. By mid-morning Friday, there were over 50 people involved in the search. They spread out across the valley in a coordinated grid pattern, checking every road, every field, every stand of trees. Overhead, a highway patrol helicopter made sweeps of the area, the crew scanning the ground with binoculars for any sign of Jennifer's truck or other clues. Jennifer's parents, Robert and Patricia Hayes, arrived from Bozeman around 10 o'clock Friday morning. Tom Mackenzie met with them in a small office at the ranger station, explaining what was being done to find their daughter. Patricia was beside herself, barely able to speak, her face blotched with tears. Robert tried to maintain composure, asking detailed questions about the investigation, about what evidence had been found, about what the next steps would be. But Tom could see the father was holding himself together through sheer force of will, channeling his terror into a need for information, for action, for something that felt like progress rather than helpless waiting. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came late Friday afternoon. A rancher named Bill Thornton was checking a fence line on the far eastern edge of his property, an area where his land bordered Forest Service ground. He was on horseback, following the fence north toward where it intersected with an old logging road. Through a stand of pines about 200 yards from the fence, he spotted something that didn't belong, something white among the dark tree trunks. Bill rode his horse through the trees to investigate. What he found was Jennifer's Toyota pickup sitting at the end of Forest Service Road 3374, the same logging road Dale had directed Jennifer onto the previous evening. The truck sat in a small clearing, surrounded by pine forest on three sides and open to a view west toward the gravelly range on the fourth. The driver's side door was hanging open. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position. The truck was empty. Bill immediately rode back to his ranch house and told his wife to call the sheriff. Within 20 minutes, Tom Mackenzie, Ray Coleman, and a state police evidence team that had been standing by in Ennis were at the scene. The evidence team cordoned off the area with yellow crime scene tape strung from tree to tree. They photographed everything before anyone touched anything, documenting the scene exactly as it had been found. The scene told a story, though not a complete one. There were clear signs of a struggle or at least of someone leaving the vehicle hastily. Scuff marks in the dirt around the driver's door suggested feet dragging or scrambling. A piece of torn fabric, blue denim later identified as coming from Jennifer's jeans, was caught on a sharp branch about 15 feet from the truck. Most ominously, two spent shell casings lay in the dirt approximately 30 feet from the vehicle, partially concealed by tall grass. The casings were .38 caliber, fired from a revolver. Their presence suggested gunfire, violence, a confrontation. The evidence team worked methodically through the rest of Friday afternoon and into Saturday. They collected every piece of potential evidence. They fingerprinted the truck's interior and exterior, finding dozens of prints. Most were Jennifer's, her prints all over the steering wheel, door handles, dashboard. But there were other prints too, unidentified prints on the passenger door handle, on the glove compartment, on the frame of the passenger window. They swabbed for DNA, taking samples from the seats, the steering wheel, anywhere someone might have left biological traces. On the passenger side door frame, they found something particularly significant. A small smear of blood, just a few drops, barely visible against the truck's white paint. The blood was sent for typing. It would later be confirmed as Jennifer's blood type, a positive. But more importantly, mixed with that blood were traces that the 1998 technology couldn't fully process: epithelial cells from another individual, skin cells probably transferred during a struggle. The sample was carefully preserved, labeled, and stored, waiting for a day when technology might catch up to what investigators needed. The staging of the scene was amateurish, suggesting either panic or inexperience. If this had been meant to look like Jennifer was attacked at this location, the details didn't support that narrative. Her backpack was found about 10 feet from the truck, lying in the grass as if tossed there. But why would an attacker take the time to remove her backpack from the truck and throw it on the ground? Why would the keys still be in the ignition? And most tellingly, why were there shell casings from a revolver lying on the ground? If someone had fired a gun during an attack, wouldn't they collect the casings? Or if the attack was spontaneous, why would the casings be so far from the truck? Tom Mackenzie stood beside the truck as the evidence team worked, his mind racing through possibilities. This wasn't a random attack by a stranger. The location was too remote, too far off any traveled route. Whoever had brought Jennifer's truck here knew this logging road, knew it wouldn't be discovered quickly. This was someone local. The shell casings bothered him most. They suggested a violent confrontation, shots fired, but where? Not here. There was no blood trail leading away from the truck, no signs of a prolonged struggle, just those scuff marks by the door and the torn piece of fabric. The violence had happened somewhere else, and the truck had been brought here afterward to throw off the investigation. Tom called for expanded search teams to focus on the area around where the truck was found. If Jennifer had been attacked here or nearby, there might be more evidence, more clues. The teams spread out, searching the forest in expanding circles from the truck. They brought in tracking dogs from Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, highly trained German shepherds and bloodhounds used to track escaped prisoners. The dogs were given items of Jennifer's clothing from her cabin to establish scent, then set to work. The dogs picked up a scent trail that led east from the truck, upslope into thicker forest. The handlers followed, along with several deputies and Forest Service personnel who knew the terrain. The trail led up a ridge, through dense lodgepole pine, over rocky areas where tracking was difficult. After about half a mile, the trail ended abruptly on a rocky outcrop where the scent dispersed. The handlers tried to pick it up again, working in circles around the last known point, but it was gone. Either Jennifer had been carried from that point, or the terrain and wind had scattered the scent beyond the dog's ability to follow. For the next week, the search intensified. More volunteers arrived from across Montana, people who'd heard about Jennifer's disappearance on the news and wanted to help. At its peak, over 200 people were involved, combing through the forests and valleys of the gravelly range. The Montana National Guard provided helicopter support, flying grid patterns with crews scanning the ground using binoculars and thermal imaging cameras that could detect body heat even through forest canopy. Divers from the Montana Highway Patrol searched sections of the Madison River and nearby Ennis Lake, working on the grim possibility that Jennifer's body had been disposed of in water. They found nothing relevant. Search and rescue teams explored abandoned mine shafts in the area, dozens of them, remnants of Montana's 1800s gold rush. Most were partially collapsed or flooded, but several were still accessible. Teams rappelled into the shafts, searching the dark passages with powerful lights. They found old mining equipment, rotted timbers, the bones of animals that had fallen in over the decades, but no sign of Jennifer. As the days passed with no new evidence, the investigation necessarily shifted from search and rescue to criminal investigation. The assumption, unspoken but understood by everyone involved, was that Jennifer Hayes was no longer alive. The question now was who had killed her and where her body was hidden. Tom Mackenzie assembled a task force that included Ray Coleman, 2 state police detectives from Helena, and an FBI agent from the Bureau's Butte field office. They began systematically interviewing everyone in the Madison Valley, building profiles, looking for connections, trying to identify anyone who might have had reason to harm Jennifer. Dale Richter's name kept coming up in these interviews. Multiple people mentioned that Dale had shown unusual interest in Jennifer. The cashier at the Ennis General Store, Susan Hartley, recalled Dale coming in several times and asking questions about Jennifer. Did she have a boyfriend? Where was she from? How long was she staying in the valley? Susan had found the questions odd, inappropriate, but Dale had a way of making everything sound casual, as if he was just making conversation. A waitress at the Ennis Cafe, a young woman named Amy Lopez, remembered seeing Dale sitting in his truck outside the cafe on several occasions, seeming to watch through the window when Jennifer was inside having lunch. Amy mentioned this to her manager at the time, and they'd kept an eye on Dale, but he never came inside, never did anything overtly threatening. He just sat in his truck and watched. Dorothy McAllister, when she returned from Bozeman and was interviewed by investigators, reported that Jennifer had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around Dale. He'd stopped by the cabin uninvited, Dorothy said, and had lingered too long despite Jennifer's polite attempts to send him away. Jennifer had also told Dorothy about seeing Dale parked near her survey trails early in the morning, watching her. Most significantly, 2 different neighbors reported seeing Dale with binoculars, apparently watching Jennifer's cabin from his property. Ed Parker, whose ranch land adjoined Dale's to the west, said he'd seen Dale standing outside his trailer multiple times with binoculars pointed toward the McAllister property. Once, Ed had driven over and confronted Dale about it. Dale had become defensive, claiming he was watching for coyotes that had been killing his chickens. But Ed said there was no doubt where those binoculars had been pointed. They were aimed at Jennifer's cabin, not at any chicken coop. On July 24, 8 days after Jennifer's disappearance, Ray Coleman brought Dale Richter in for formal questioning. The interview took place in a small room on the second floor of the Madison County Courthouse in Virginia City, the old territorial capital. The courthouse was a beautiful stone building from the 1870s, but the interrogation room was stark and cramped, containing only a metal table, 3 chairs, and a tape recorder that looked like it dated from the 1960s. Dale arrived with a public defender from Bozeman, a young lawyer named Michael Torres who'd been appointed because Dale couldn't afford private counsel. Torres advised Dale to answer questions but to be careful, not to volunteer information, to stop immediately if he felt uncomfortable. Dale nodded but seemed more worried about the interview itself than about his lawyer's advice. Ray began with basic questions, establishing background. How long had Dale lived in the valley? What kind of work did he do? How well did he know Jennifer Hayes? Dale's answers were short, defensive. He'd lived in the valley for 15 years. He did odd jobs, mostly ranch work and handyman stuff. He barely knew Jennifer, had maybe talked to her once or twice in passing. Ray asked about the evening of July 16. Dale said he'd been home alone, working on his vehicles. He'd heard Jennifer's truck drive past around 7:30 or 8, heading toward the McAllister property. That was the last time he'd heard or seen anything related to her. He'd stayed home the rest of the evening, hadn't gone anywhere, hadn't seen anyone. Ray asked Dale to account for his vehicle mileage. Dale said he hadn't driven anywhere that evening, but when Ray pointed out that Dale's truck odometer showed approximately 40 miles added between July 15 and July 17, Dale became flustered. He said he might have driven into Ennis or Dillon for supplies. He couldn't remember exactly. He drove around a lot, checking on job sites, looking at vehicles and equipment he might want to buy. He couldn't account for every mile. Ray pressed him about his interest in Jennifer. Multiple witnesses had seen Dale watching Jennifer's cabin, asking questions about her, sitting outside the cafe observing her. What was that about? Dale's face flushed. He admitted he found Jennifer attractive, said he'd thought about asking her out but had been too shy. He became defensive when Ray asked about the binoculars, insisting again that he'd been looking for coyotes, not spying on Jennifer. The interview lasted nearly 4 hours. Dale never admitted to any involvement in Jennifer's disappearance, but his story was inconsistent and contradictory. He claimed to barely know Jennifer, yet he knew specific details about her daily routine, when she left for work, when she typically came home, where she liked to have lunch in Ennis. He said he'd been home alone all evening on July 16, but he couldn't explain the mileage on his truck, couldn't provide any way to verify his whereabouts, couldn't name anyone who might have seen him. The investigators wanted to search Dale's property and vehicles more thoroughly. Dale initially refused, saying he knew his rights and that police needed a warrant. But after conferring with his lawyer, and under pressure from Ray, who suggested that refusal to cooperate would make Dale look guilty, Dale agreed to a voluntary search. He signed a consent form, and the next day, Saturday, August 1st, a team of state police investigators and forensic technicians descended on his property. They spent 8 hours going through everything. The trailer was searched room by room, every drawer opened, every closet examined, every piece of furniture moved. They photographed everything, collected samples of anything that might be relevant. The yard was searched similarly, investigators poking through the piles of junk, examining the interiors of the abandoned vehicles, checking outbuildings and sheds. They found nothing that directly connected Dale to Jennifer's disappearance. No items of her clothing, no jewelry, no identification. No visible bloodstains, though they sprayed luminol in various locations and collected samples of any spots that reacted. Those samples would later test negative for human blood. The trailer was messy, cluttered with the accumulated possessions of a man who lived alone and didn't throw much away, but there was no evidence of a crime. Dale's 3 vehicles were towed to a state police garage in Bozeman for detailed examination. Forensic technicians went over each one inch by inch. They vacuumed the interiors, collecting every fiber, every hair, every particle of dirt. They took samples from the seats, the carpeting, the door panels. They examined the beds of the trucks for signs of having carried a body or other evidence. They found nothing. No blood, no hair that matched Jennifer's, no fibers from her clothing. The .38 revolver that Dale kept in his trailer, a Smith Wesson Model 10 that he'd owned for years, was seized and taken to the state crime lab for analysis. A ballistics expert test-fired the weapon and compared the rifling marks on test bullets to the shell casings found near Jennifer's truck. The rifling didn't match. The casings from the crime scene had been fired from a different weapon, one with different barrel characteristics. The expert could say with certainty that the casings found at the scene had not come from Dale's Smith Wesson. When asked about other firearms he might own or have access to, Dale said he'd had a second .38 revolver, an old Colt Detective Special he'd bought at a gun show in Billings several years earlier. He'd sold it, also at a gun show, in February or March of 1998. He couldn't remember who bought it, didn't have any paperwork. It had been a cash transaction, no receipt, no registration transfer. Montana law in 1998 didn't require background checks or paperwork for private sales between individuals at gun shows. The gun could be anywhere, in anyone's hands, impossible to trace. Investigators tried to track down that second revolver but had no luck. They contacted gun show organizers, talked to dealers who regularly attended shows in Billings, put out requests for information. Nothing turned up. The gun had vanished as completely as Jennifer herself. Without physical evidence connecting Dale to the crime, without witnesses, without a body, the investigation stalled. The county attorney reviewed the case carefully. There was plenty of suspicion, plenty of circumstantial evidence that made Dale look guilty. His obsessive interest in Jennifer, his inconsistent statements, his inability to account for his time and vehicle mileage, his ownership of a second .38 revolver that conveniently disappeared months before the crime. But suspicion wasn't proof. Inconsistent statements weren't proof. The county attorney's professional opinion was that no jury would convict based on what they had. A good defense attorney would tear their case apart, would argue that all they had was speculation and that Dale was being scapegoated because the police couldn't find the real perpetrator. Dale Richter was released from custody after 48 hours of questioning and searching. He returned to his trailer, but his life in the Madison Valley was effectively over. The community had convicted him in the court of public opinion. People crossed the street to avoid him in Ennis. Former clients stopped calling him for work. Someone spray-painted murderer on the side of his trailer in large red letters. When Dale tried to report this vandalism to Ray Coleman, Ray's response was lukewarm at best. Yes, it was technically a crime, Ray said, but under the circumstances, could Dale really expect much sympathy? Dale's isolation deepened over the following months and years. He stopped going into Ennis almost entirely, driving instead to Dillon or Butte when he needed supplies, an hour's drive each way to avoid the stares and whispers. He lived on his property like a hermit, emerging only rarely. His phone rang constantly with threatening calls until he finally disconnected the service. Letters arrived, some threatening violence, others containing religious tracts about hell and damnation. Dale burned them all in a barrel behind his trailer, watching the smoke rise into the Montana sky. For the Hayes family, the weeks and months following the discovery of Jennifer's truck were a slow descent into a particular kind of hell. The confirmation that violence had occurred, the blood in the truck, the shell casings, the evidence of struggle, made it increasingly unlikely that Jennifer was still alive. But without a body, without definitive proof, hope refused to die entirely, and that faint irrational hope was in some ways more painful than acceptance would have been. Patricia Hayes clung to increasingly impossible scenarios. Maybe Jennifer had amnesia and was wandering somewhere, unable to remember who she was. Maybe she'd been kidnapped but was being held alive, and might still be rescued. Maybe she would simply walk through the door one day with an extraordinary story of survival. Patricia knew these thoughts were irrational, but she couldn't stop them. Accepting that Jennifer was dead meant accepting a future without her daughter, and Patricia wasn't ready for that. Robert Hayes was more realistic, though he kept his darkest thoughts to himself to protect his wife. He knew Jennifer was dead. He knew someone had killed her. And he believed, with absolute certainty, that Dale Richter was responsible. Robert wanted justice, but justice seemed impossible without evidence, without proof, without the one thing they didn't have, Jennifer's body. He met repeatedly with Tom Mackenzie and the county attorney, pressing them to find a way to charge Dale. The answer was always the same. Without more evidence, their hands were tied. In September 1998, Robert Hayes hired Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator specializing in missing persons cases. Webb had a reputation for solving difficult cases, for seeing angles that police investigators might miss, for bringing fresh perspectives to stale investigations. He'd successfully located several missing persons and had helped secure convictions in 2 cold case homicides in other states. Webb arrived in Madison County in early October and spent 3 months working the case full-time. He re-interviewed everyone the police had talked to, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. He examined the physical evidence, consulted with forensic experts from around the country, developed psychological profiles of potential suspects. He drove every road in the valley, familiarizing himself with the terrain, understanding the logistics of how someone could abduct Jennifer and dispose of her body without being seen. His final report, delivered to Robert and Patricia Hayes in January 1999, was thorough and professionally written, but its conclusions were devastating. Webb believed Jennifer had been murdered within hours of her disappearance, probably on the evening of July 16. He believed her body was hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Gravelly Range, possibly in one of the dozens of abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed those mountains from the mining era. He believed the person responsible was almost certainly Dale Richter, based on Dale's obsessive interest in Jennifer, his inconsistent and suspicious behavior, his inability to provide an alibi, and his intimate knowledge of the area. But Webb also concluded that without Jennifer's body, without physical evidence directly connecting Dale to the crime, and without any witnesses to the actual abduction or murder, the case was likely unsolvable. He recommended that the Hayes family accept that they might never have complete answers, that they might never see justice for their daughter, that their best path forward was to find a way to grieve and move on. It was the hardest thing Webb had ever had to tell a client, he said, but it was the truth as he saw it. The Hayes family rejected Webb's advice to let go. They couldn't. Robert continued to press law enforcement, writing letters to the Montana Attorney General, to the FBI, to anyone he thought might help. Patricia threw herself into advocacy for other families of missing persons, channeling her grief into action. But as the months turned into years, the reality of Webb's assessment became impossible to deny. By the end of 1999, 18 months after Jennifer's disappearance, the case had been officially moved to the Madison County Sheriff's Office cold case files. Active investigation had ceased. The thick file, hundreds of pages of reports and photographs and witness statements, was sealed and placed on a metal shelf in the basement of the courthouse in Virginia City. The case wasn't closed, but it wasn't being actively worked either. It had joined the ranks of unsolved mysteries, cases that would only be reopened if significant new evidence emerged. Ray Coleman retired in 2001, haunted by the case he couldn't solve. On his last day in uniform, he drove out to the spot where Jennifer's truck had been found and stood in silence for 20 minutes, as if the forest might finally whisper its secrets. It didn't. Tom McKenzie retired the same year, passing the sheriff's badge to his deputy. Robert and Patricia Hayes divorced in 2003, the strain of Jennifer's disappearance destroying a marriage that had lasted 28 years. Dale Richter continued living in his trailer, the suspicions surrounding him gradually fading as new residents moved into the valley and old residents died or moved away. The years passed with agonizing slowness. Every July 16th, Robert and Patricia separately made pilgrimages to the Madison Valley, placing flowers at the memorial site where Jennifer's truck had been found. The case became a local legend, a story older residents told newer ones, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk even in peaceful rural communities. Then, in 2015, everything changed. Madison County elected a new sheriff, Sarah Donnelly, a 41-year-old former Seattle police detective who had returned to her native Montana with fresh ideas and a particular interest in cold cases. She had seen how advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, were solving decades-old crimes across the country. One of her first acts as sheriff was to pull the Jennifer Hayes file from storage. Sheriff Donnelly spent weeks reading every page, studying every detail. She saw immediately that the case had potential. There was physical evidence that had been properly preserved. There was a clear suspect. What had been missing in 1998 was technology. By 2015, that technology existed. Donnelly contacted the Montana State Crime Lab and requested that all biological evidence be re-examined using modern forensic method. The blood sample from Jennifer's truck was tested using advanced DNA analysis. The results confirmed it was Jennifer's blood, but more importantly, technicians found epithelial cells mixed with that blood, skin cells from another individual that had been transferred during a struggle. The DNA profile from those cells was extracted and entered into CODIS, the national database. There was no match. The person who'd left those cells had never been arrested for a felony. But Donnelly knew about forensic genetic genealogy, the technique that had solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018. She contacted Parabon Nanolabs, and in January 2023, they uploaded the unknown DNA profile to GEDMAT. After 3 months of painstaking genealogical research, building family trees from distant relatives, they identified Dale Richter. The likelihood that the DNA belonged to anyone else was less than 1 in a billion. Donnelly needed a fresh DNA sample to confirm the match. In late April 2023, surveillance teams followed Dale to a gas station in Ennis. He bought a coffee, drank it outside, and discarded the cup in a trash can. Detectives retrieved the cup. The DNA from it matched perfectly with the crime scene evidence. On May 2, 2023, 25 years after Jennifer Hayes vanished, Dale Richter was arrested. The community was stunned. Robert Hayes, now 73, broke down when he received the call. Patricia Hayes felt relief mixed with renewed grief. The arrest meant Jennifer was truly gone, that the faint hope she'd carried for a quarter century was finally extinguished. Dale maintained his innocence initially, but cracks appeared in his story during interrogation. He admitted he'd lied in 1998, that he had seen Jennifer that evening, that he'd asked her for a ride. His attorney advised him to say nothing more. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. The trial took place in February 2024 in Bozeman. The prosecution presented the timeline, the physical evidence, the DNA analysis. Genetic genealogists explained how they'd traced the family tree to Dale Richter. Former Deputy Ray Coleman, now 84 and in failing health, testified about the original investigation. Jennifer's parents described their decades of anguish. The defense argued weakly that Dale had been with Jennifer but hadn't killed her, that someone else must have been responsible. The prosecution dismantled every argument. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a verdict: guilty of deliberate homicide and kidnapping. Dale Richter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Hayes family and the Madison Valley community, the verdict brought complicated closure. Jennifer was still gone. Her body had never been recovered, likely hidden in one of the countless abandoned mine shafts in the Gravelly Range. Dale refused to reveal the location, his final act of control. In June 2024, a memorial service was held at the site where Jennifer's truck had been found. Nearly 200 people attended. Patricia Hayes planted a lodgepole pine tree, a living memorial that would grow in the mountains Jennifer had loved. Robert Hayes spoke about never giving up hope for justice. The case became a landmark in forensic genetic genealogy, cited in courtrooms and classrooms across the country. Sheriff Donnelly became an advocate for cold case units and modern investigative technique. Patricia Hayes established the Jennifer Hayes Memorial Foundation, which sponsored genetic genealogy analysis for other unsolved cases. 3 more Montana homicides were solved within 2 years using the same technique. Robert Hayes continued searching for Jennifer's remains until his death in September 2026 at age 78. He never found her, but he died knowing her killer had been brought to justice. Dale Richter remains at Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, his health declining. He has never confessed, never revealed where Jennifer's body lies. The mountains keep that secret still. The Madison Valley continues beneath its big sky, beautiful and indifferent. The river flows, cattle graze, eagles soar. But for those who remember, the valley holds a deeper meaning. It is a place where justice came 25 years late, pulled from the earth by stubborn persistence and revolutionary science. It is a reminder that even in vast, isolated places where help is 40 minutes away, the truth can still emerge. Sometimes it takes a quarter century. Sometimes it takes a DNA match and a discarded coffee cup. But justice comes. And when it does, it brings not just closure but the possibility of healing for those who waited in darkness, refusing to let another young woman vanish into silence. The case of Jennifer Hayes stands as testament to the power of modern forensic science and the dedication of those who refuse to give up on victims. It proves that no case is ever truly cold, that advances in technology can reach back across decades, that families who wait for answers may finally receive them. If this story moved you, if you believe that justice matters no matter how long delayed, subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories of cold cases solved, of investigators who never give up, of families who wait years for truth. Hit the notification bell for the latest cases. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, where we continue to shine light on cases that time tried to bury.